Not
I'm
yet.
about
Okay.
to start us, and I will introduce you. Okay,
Thank
in
you.
just
Well,
about a minute.
while you're working on it, Maida, we let Sheldon introduce himself to us, and we may
No,
introduce to.
Yes.
we're
Yes.
starting. Now be quiet.
And I
Okay,
will
you start.
introduce you.
Hush, 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 hush. And I'm ready to start. So be quiet. I know what I'm doing. Just be quiet. All right, here we go. We are live and we're recording. Very good. All right. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's talk about land and climate. I think it's high time for us to pay some attention to some of the practical things that we have to worry about when it comes to saving the world from global warming. And one of the things we have to think about is what's going to happen to the land and to the agriculture, and how we're going to get our food, and what are we going to do. So I have three friends here who are, they're friends of mine, but they don't know each other. They're about to get acquainted. And they all are from very different backgrounds and interests and don't necessarily have much in common. That's our new angle. We're going to bring together people who may not know each other very well and see if they can find common ground. So the first person I want to say hello to is Tony McQuail, who is our only real farmer. And Tony is an organic farmer in a little place called Lucknow, Ontario, Canada. And I'm sure he will set us straight whenever I make some bloopers about how to use land, and obviously reveal the fact that I absolutely know nothing about farming. I was telling somebody yesterday that I think I raised carrots once, or I planted carrots and they didn't grow. And that's my entire experience with farming. I think I probably got three little spindly carrots out of the whole expedition. Anyway, in Peterborough, Ontario is Alan Slavin, who is a longtime friend of mine. I don't see him much, but he is a retired physics professor at Trent University in Peterborough. Al, I know you belong to some sort of organization of grandparents or seniors concerned about climate change and protecting our grandchildren, right? What's the name of your outfit?
It's called For Our Grandchildren.
For our
And
grandchildren.
we formed about 10 years ago in Peterborough, although I must admit we're now talking about whether the name is appropriate since climate change is on us now. It's not for our grandchildren anymore. It's for us and our children and our grandchildren. So,
All right, well, we'll get to that for sure. And a real treat for me is to get to go to Arizona, to a place near the Grand Canyon, where I'm going to speak with a Navajo artist. And isn't that different? This is Sheldon Harvey, who is a Navajo artist. He teaches art at a Navajo community college in a little town, which I've had trouble finding on the map. But it's good to see you today, Sheldon. And I see you're wearing a mask, but you wanted to introduce yourself a little bit. And so please take a second and do so. Tell us about yourself.
Yes. My name is Sheldon Harvey. um, that's my English name.
Mhm.
And I want to just express a little bit about our language. Tachini, Ashi, Tanesani, Ado Betatni. And it's good to meet you all. It's good to be a part of this.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay. So what you said was in Navajo language?
Yes, that's our language that we speak here.
Mhm.
We
Say a little
do
more. Say, hello, Meta Spencer. How are you today?
Yate Meta. Yate Nsago. Yeah, Nsago.
Thank you. All right. I'm fine, thank you. Now, I understand that during World War II, one of the great ways in which the Americans were able to escape being overheard by the enemy was that they asked some Navajo soldiers to speak in Navajo when discussing sensitive military issues. Is
Yeah.
that a true story?
Yes, it's very true, but we have a different philosophy here. We don't call these people enemies. I think that, the Japanese people have, really thrived and struggled. And I just want you to know that as Navajo, we don't we don't consider them enemies.
All right.
And
Okay.
yes,
That's a
yes,
good
okay.
philosophy. I don't know how well it works if you're a soldier, but
Yeah, yeah. When you're a soldier, you really gotta protect yourself.
well, we could be off on another conversation about peace very easily because I think all of us have a background in opposing war, different ways of opposing war. But our conversation today is really intended to be about what we're going to do and what we can expect to have happen to land and how we're going to feed the human population given the inexorable advance of global warming and what it is doing to our local areas, what kinds of problems we're encountering. Now, none of us, only Tony is a farmer, and only Tony knows really is an expert. The rest
Mhm.
of us will have to just be um, tolerant of each other for not knowing enough to be accurate. But at any rate, Tony, start us off and
Well,
tell us what you think is going to happen and what we should all be concerned about and what we should be doing. And then I think there are going to be local variations as people talk about the situation in their areas. So do you mind, Tony?
sure. No, I'll be happy to start. And I'd like to start with what Sheldon said, which is, I mean, we are all interconnected. We're all about 80% water. We all need food to feed our bodies. I always try and get people to understand that that's the most important energy. And we've gotten so caught up on stuff that lets us do stuff with tools and equipment and machines. But really, it is if we're going to survive on this planet, we got to focus on what are our essentials. So air connects us all, water connects us all, food connects us all. And we are very much going to have to think very locally as well as thinking globally. And I heard Alan say that he's got a garden. I don't know, Sheldon, but you probably have some connections with local food producers, or maybe you're a local food producer yourself. And so while farming, I think, has a really potentially important role to play in a transition that we're going to have to make, each of us thinking of what can we do at our local level in our local communities to source food locally, to grow as much of our own food in our yards as we can, manage our land, because it's the land that you're connected to and love that's going to help you connect and reach out to connecting to the planet. Because what we're really talking is a very old approach, which indigenous communities have had for the millennia that they've survived in, which is knowing your land and being at peace in your land and understanding that you're a part of your land and you're connected to all the other parts, the animals, the plants, the minerals, all these cycles that connect us. And so I wanted to set that baseline, because so often in discussions about climate, or as Sheldon was saying, people aren't your enemies. They're just people who see the world in a different way. And how do we then get to understand each other? And yeah, there's a lot to cause us to have a sense of despair. And I certainly, when I got started on some of this 50 years ago, it was for grandkids I did not yet have. And then it was for kids I had and grandkids I had, and on to those other generations. And now it's very definitely, we're talking about, if we're going to say self-interest motivates people to some extent, we're getting to the point where this is self-interest. It's the floods that are going to take your house. It's the wildfires that are going to take your place. And so we have created a situation that exacerbates negative natural cycles of renewal and regeneration. And it's how do we pull back? So before I talk about agriculture, I want to say agriculture can play a big role, but figuring out how we reduce our energy use and reduce the expectations and demands that we put on the planet. And as a farmer, when we got our farm 50 years ago. It had been cash crop for many years with nothing being put back on it. The soils were in bad shape. And over 50 years, we've turned it into a very different farm with lots of space for wildlife, wild insects, wild areas that are part of the landscape of our farm. Using livestock to help regenerate soils and manage creating water habitats to hold water in the landscape. So these are all things, and something that was very helpful to us was holistic management, which is a triple bottom line management theory that says you have to look after the land, you have to look after the people, and yes, you have to look after producing something or having an income. But it says you don't concentrate on making money, because that's going to cost you in terms of, if that's your only focus, it's going to hurt land and it's going to hurt people if you don't take a balanced approach. And I'll put some information in the chat at some point on some links that may be useful to people. But to me, we went, agriculture went, I think, through some stages. And the physical stage was when we got machinery, and the moldboard plow and cultivators, and they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, which means we're creating bigger and bigger monocultures that are adapted to the machine rather than figuring out how to adapt our practices to the land that we're working on. Well, then we got into the chemical warfare stage in the Second World War, and we had to figure out how to market that stuff after the war was over. And now we got pesticides and insecticides and fungicides and fertilizers. And so we've gone into a chemical stage in agriculture where we're both the mechanical, physical, and the chemical.
Sorry, you mentioned fertilizers in that context. Didn't they have fertilizer all along?
Oh yeah, well, that was the ability to produce dynamite also produced the capacity to produce nitrogen fertilizer.
So when did that
was back 1800s, I think. Maybe Alan can give me a better sense of that. But yeah, fertilizer. But the big push in chemical fertilizer was in the 50s. After and the shift from being diversified small mixed farms where the livestock helped provide the fertility for the cycle, went back to, oh no, we can get rid of the livestock, simplify, just grow corn, just grow this, we can fertilize it with chemicals. So that was the transitional period, both in terms of the mechanization, because the tank factories were now producing tractors and implements.
We're preparing for war. Yep. And a lot of these ideas are actually war generated, and it's interesting how you're bringing up tractors because a lot of these machineries were developed at a time when they didn't need their materials anymore. It was the end of the war.
Well, we brought the war home back to the farmland, in effect, and made war on nature. This whole idea that we've got to keep all the insect pests away, and it was actually counterproductive. But that's another story. But to go on with but we've gone through this mechanical, chemical. I think we're now reverting to a biological understanding of agriculture, which says you've got to have a healthy soil that's full of active microbial populations, fungal populations, and that's what builds the nutrients to create a healthy plant that can both nourish human beings and nourish the animals on it. So regenerative agriculture has been very focused on making that transition, and to me it has a whole lot of what I would like to call collateral benefits, which is that while you're now starting to sequester carbon, but you're building soil organic matter, you're also building food that's more nutrient dense. You're creating landscapes that will absorb a heavy rainfall rather than have it go off in flooding, and that'll hold water in case of drought. And so they're all.
Isn't that what we're going through right now? I mean, I see like the news. I watched the news today, and they are getting flooded. They're getting flooded on the East Coast. And they're making it sound very dramatic. They're making it sound like, it's the worst thing on the planet. And I'm sitting here in a desert and we're like, this is, you should be blessed by the water. And it's very interesting that you said that. And you mentioned that because I just watched the news this morning and I'm like, man, you guys are getting flooded and it should be a blessing.
Where is it being flooded? I haven't turned on the news. I don't know.
Well,
Oh,
there's a,
where's the
This is
you
the
know the,
hurricane that's come up through Florida,
yeah, it's
Eden. And so
Florida.
the serious flooding as you get just inland a little bit north of Florida.
Yeah. And you're right, Sheldon. It should be a blessing, but we have to manage the land so it can absorb large quantities of rainfall because it's porous, it's got rich life and rich organic matter and good root systems. And that, in terms of what anyone can do, is manage your land so it has something covering it, or something that when you do get a rain in the desert, the water soaks in rather than hitting crusted layers and running off.
So are you
And
saying that we should go back to natural waterways rather than create dams and rather than create ditches?
well, certainly look at what was being done on the land. I mean, I believe that there were little rock impoundment circles made on land that were created, which would hold water when you got a sudden rain in the desert. We were in Albuquerque and New Mexico and Arizona last year for the Regenerate conference. And there was some work being done by folks who were using indigenous water capturing and water holding techniques. So I think looking at those, but also in holistic management, we talk about the importance of having ground covered either with growing plants or, plant material, trampled grass or whatever, as a way of getting water down into the soil rather than running the risk of it running off, and then creating flooding, requiring more ditching, more protection from dams, all this costly infrastructure, which if you manage the soil surface, the land surface, so that it absorbs water, you don't need so much. But I should let others talk, but regenerative agriculture is all about trying to think like nature, trying to manage the system the way it was being managed. And when it comes to livestock, that means moving the animals around so that they eat an area down, poop and pee all over it, and then move on and let it recover. And in that way, you build capacity and build soil, and which is what we do on our farm, and it's made a big difference. But I don't want to dominate this.
No, but I do want to follow up what you're just saying there, because you've used the word regenerative, and that's a sort of a vague term. But when you talk about what you've just said about moving animals around, I do want to follow up on that, because I've been very interested for the last 4, 5, 10 years in the work that came out of Alan Savory's research in Africa, and his techniques of moving animals around the way they used to move when they were wild herds of big animals. Now, what I'm trying to figure out is how much acceptance is there now in mainstream agriculture, in what they teach in agricultural courses at universities, and researchers do that kind of thing. How much do they believe that now? How much do they say that you can actually restore and protect the land best by having lots of animals being herded around in a very organized way? Or is that still, when I first began to read about Alan Savory, I think he was regarded as kind of a crackpot, but I don't think that's quite true anymore. Tell me about that. Is that true?
Well, I think there's certainly circles where he is still viewed as a bit of a crackpot, and he certainly can be an assertive person, which doesn't always make other people who have been promoting different perspectives or views for a long time very happy. But I think, yes, he's gotten much greater coverage. I've just put some things in the chat with links to his TED Talk and a video on the work he's done in Africa. And certainly in terms of regenerative agriculture has grown dramatically because people are finding that it works. And particularly if you're in economic stress because the intensive agriculture system hasn't been working for you and you're losing money because the margins are very small and the input costs are very large. regenerative agriculture is growing significantly. And in Canada, I just want to share that about 5 years ago, some of us were talking about the need for this to not only be done farm by farm, but for there to be, national policy and national effort and coordination. And out of that grew an organization called Farmers for Climate Solutions. And it started off with 6 organizations as a little project of another NGO. It's grown into its own organization and has 29 participating farm and land-based organizations who believe that we can do so much more to make our land management consistent with a healthy ecosystem, and it's not just carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. It's how we manage things so that our water cycle is healthy, so that we don't just rush off water through drainage and ditches, but keep it in the landscape so that it can feed the plants water, evapotranspiration can feed the clouds, and then the water can come back down across the country, so it's to me, it's a very hopeful thing. I think Alan Savory is much better respected, and the concepts and techniques of holistic management are better respected. The reason I'm comfortable with the term regenerative agriculture is it is a big net. And within it, you can have ecological and organic and permaculture. But you need something that's pretty highly adaptable to local areas, because that's where the rubber meets the road, or hopefully the footprints meet the land, because that's where people actually manage to do stuff. And so figuring out what your local context or your local environment is, how you need to manage it. And that's why, Sheldon, what I'm doing in my relatively humid area may be totally inappropriate where you are, but there's going to be lots of stuff that will talk about, well, how do we manage water in the past, and then how can we manage what we're doing on the land to get roots in the system when there's water, hold on to that water, keep it with us.
I know in the Peterborough area, no-till farming has become the norm. You rarely see plowed fields anymore, and you hear a lot about cover crops. But I think that the cover crops are still being eliminated mostly by Roundup, not by mechanical means. I haven't seen. I mean, I was looking at a video recently, a Rodale video that showed a machine that was designed specifically to sort of mow down and chomp up cover crops so that you'd have a really thick mulch layer before you did your drill planting. But I mean, that I haven't seen that kind of thing going on in this area. Is that really still very much the exception, or is cover planting that doesn't use Roundup becoming more common?
I'm afraid there's still a lot of Roundup being used on cover crops. One of the things that can be thought through is, particularly if you're doing a cover crop late summer, early fall, is to use a series of plants that will winter kill in Canada, and let winter kill and the snow loading on that mulch down that material. The winter rye is probably the thing you were seeing being rolled down and crimped, and it's a plant that winters over and makes very, very good weed suppression, aggressive growth in the spring. But that crimping, if you crimp it at the right stage when it's headed up, you break the stems, and then it becomes a mulch that you can no-till plant through. But what we need, and hopefully this is something Farmers for Climate Solutions can work on, is getting more effort to research those kind of alternatives, and getting people to then experiment with it, try it. But a lot of these things come from farmers doing the work rather than researchers. Unfortunately, at the university level, people can get so siloed and so focused that they don't, they get a great idea, but you have, as a farmer, you have to think about, if I'm going to crimp my rye, am I going to get a dry enough day to do it when it's at the right stage? And so there's a lot, there's a lot of juggling goes on in farming. Adapting.
Well, I'd like to hear about the local situations. I mean, I don't know whether there's much variation when you compare Peterborough to Lucknow, because you're both in Ontario, but I bet there's a lot of variation when we compare either of those places to the dry areas around the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And I imagine that the problem there has a lot to do with what I've heard is the changing situation about the Colorado River, that it's all gone. Can
Yeah,
you speak to that a little bit, Sheldon? What's going on there, and is that affecting real agriculture in the area where you live?
yes, that's a very, very, thank you for saying that. Um, yes, we've been going through some very difficult times with some water rights issues
Mhm.
with Native America and with America. So what I've seen lately is we have had a very, very good harvest. And it might be because of this tropical storm.
Oh, what do you
We
mean? You had a tropical storm in your area?
no. It's because of this this idea that you see on the news, but we've been having a very large amount of water coming through the lands, and it really disturbs a lot of people because it disturbs the roads. It's been
I
breaking
mean, in
down.
Arizona, you've been having a lot of rain.
Yeah, yeah, and
Mhm.
we're having a great harvest,
Mhm.
but a lot of these ideas about farming, it's we've been taking away the natural waterways, and we've been building roads, we've been building, homes and things like that. So a lot of these ideas are really hard to understand in a way where we're struggling with the fact that it's just not we're not we don't have those natural waterways,
Mm.
and those were the ideas from our past, and how we farmed. We weren't trying to control nature. Nature controlled us, and I think that's how we that's how we're still here.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Okay, Al, what's happening around Peterborough?
So around around Peterborough, as I said, it looks like some of the no-till has basically taken over, but I haven't seen very much in the way. Well, there are cover crops are being used, but I suspect that they're being put down largely with Roundup, as we've already discussed. Um, Beyond that, in terms of agriculture, I mean, we've got an evolution into larger and larger farm holdings where one farmer will farm the land that belongs to, half a dozen or a dozen different people. So the farms are becoming much bigger. So there's definitely a factory farming. I did have one question for Tony, and that is on the talk of, developing regenerative agriculture that absorbs more water. I mean, what's happening at the moment, because of Hurricane Helene in the States? I mean, it seems to me that that's something that probably all the regenerative agriculture in the world isn't going to be able to solve, because those storms of that magnitude are not common in the area. I mean, yes, occasional hurricanes, but not the kind of regularity that we've had from climate change. So do you have any sense at all to the extent that regenerative agriculture can actually deal with a deluge like they're experiencing at the moment?
Well, these kind of storms certainly weren't that common. If you look at the forest fire, wildfire experience in California recently, things have gotten much bigger, much faster, much more frequently. So I think the kind of storms we're looking at may become all too much of a norm. But that's where regenerative agriculture can play such a role. If you read Gabe Brown's book, Dirt to Soil, From Dirt to Soil, recommended, he went from having land that would accept about a half an inch of rainfall per hour to land that would accept 8 to 9 inches of rainfall per hour. So
Which is what they've been getting
yeah, so
in the
but
area.
now if that's just your farm, maybe your neighbors' farms are being eroded away around you. But if we start thinking about watersheds and whole landscapes and how we as rural communities can start improving soil porosity, then what that means, if the whole area that's getting the tropical storm right now had the capacity to absorb, 6, 8, 10 inches an hour, you wouldn't be having the flooding. You'd be having the replenishment of aquifers. You'd be having that water coming out in deeper rivers and better streams, and not being filled with silt and agricultural chemicals. So, we're talking long range hope and long range vision. It isn't going to happen tomorrow, but as people understand the consequences of not doing this. But the other thing that's out there is how much of the area of that part of the world is paved with stuff that won't absorb water, and how much is roofed with stuff that doesn't have a water diversion going to a big cistern or something. We are flushing every time we do the toilet off to the sea it goes, unless you're on a septic tank at my place. And we have taken such a backward view of our relationship to the essentials of our life. But that's where regenerative agriculture, many years ago when we were building our house back in 1975, we got an 8-inch rain. And we had a river running through our farm from our neighbors, and we had a river running through our other neighbors that we could see because we were up on the hill. Muddy water. When we get a heavy rain now, we haven't tested it with that kind of rain, and again, but we don't have rivers running through. We don't have ponds forming. We've got ponds that we created, and we want the water to go there and be held there. But it's thinking about the whole picture.
What technology do you attribute that? Is it cover crops? Is it no-till farming? What have you done that has made that much difference?
Well, with Gabe Brown's work, it was cover crops, and it was grazing those cover crops with animals so that the manure and the urine help boost the biology in the soil.
Do you do that yourself?
Well, we are not cropping anymore. We're a hay and pasture farm. So we rotationally graze our livestock around. We've let our plants get taller and more mature so that they put down deeper root structures. And we encourage as much diversity. In my farm, there's nothing I consider a weed. If the animals will eat it, it's not a weed. If it's and if it's a thistle, there are goldfinches that eat the seeds, and there are other birds that eat the seeds. So as long as I'm not overrun, I do clip burdocks with the hand clippers if they show up and have their burrs ready to get in the fur of sheep or on the hair of the cattle or that. But I'm happy. Otherwise, burdocks are this great penetrating root going down that die after 2 years.
We want perennials more than annual crops because of their roots. Is that true?
Well, that's certainly my strategy, and certainly there is some work being done to try and develop perennial grain crops, and that has been an interesting work by the Land Institute for many years, and I think they're starting to feel they may have some things coming along. But part of the challenge is historically annuals produce lots of seed because that's how they reproduce. So that's where your wheat and your oats and your barley and then your peas and beans and lentils, are annuals that they're putting all their reproductive energy into the seeds. Whereas your perennials say, well, seeds are good and that's how we keep the community moving around, but we're going to survive this year into next year by having good root storage and having buds that'll come up in the spring. So figuring out how to eat perennials, and one of the ways we eat perennials, particularly on areas that aren't very good for cropping, is by grazing wisely and effectively with livestock. So we can eat stuff
Now look here, there's a whole big question about whether the way forward is to eat less meat and therefore have fewer live animals. I've run into several different lines of conversation. I sent all of you a little video about rewilding, which really does encourage the idea of having wild animals in a natural environment the way it was thousands of years ago. But that would have plenty of room for animals. On the other hand, there are people now talking with great enthusiasm about how we can now somebody can make protein food out of air and water and bacteria. And I think in Finland, they are beginning to actually produce, they're going to be able to make it enough so that we can all get a taste of this stuff sometime soon, because it means that you can produce all the protein that you need without animals. And they're saying, wonderful, we can get rid of all the animals, and then we can rewild the country. And I don't know how many animals you'd have there, but no more of this animal husbandry, no more of the factory farming of cattle and so on. What do you say about that, Alan? And well, Alan and everybody, what is your attitude toward the future of whether or not animals have an important place to play in maintaining the soil?
So what I will say is that, I mean, you know, animals have had a major part in our diets for a long time. I mean, what we've found over the last 20 years is there has been a major shift globally from plant protein towards animal protein. So that there's a bit more and more demand for animal protein, and that's become problematic. I mean, I think I saw one study that said that if you didn't raise animals, that you would you'd have enough land to produce enough food for far more people than we have on the earth at the moment. I mean, one of the numbers that always strikes me is that with conventional beef production, and this is conventional beef production, this is not what Tony's talking about, conventional beef production, 1 pound of hamburger basically generates 60 pounds of greenhouse gases. 1 pound of protein from lentils produces about 1 pound of greenhouse gases. So that the greenhouse gas production drops off dramatically as you depend more and more on plant protein. At the same time, I mean, you know, people love their meat protein. I think that what we need is an evolution towards plant protein, so that we're eating more of it and less of meat protein. But again, there's a balance there between what people, you know, expect, what their customs are, what their backgrounds are, what the farming abilities are in the area. So I think that that's a balance that we're working towards, but we really haven't found yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, it's also true that the question of how much it isn't just whether we like it or not. The question is what is it doing for the soil? And there are people who say that in fact, Alan Savory claimed that the desertification in the world, which is expanding, deserts are taking over the world, that this is because of the not being able to have herds of animals traveling around the way they used to, and being managed the way they should. And if you had those animals, you could restore the fertility of the soil, and that I think is what you were mentioning a little bit about that when you're talking about regenerative agriculture. It includes that notion that you do want that herds of animals are really important.
There's no doubt about what Tony says about regenerative agriculture. The kinds of things they're doing, where they're moving the herds at regular periods so they don't overgraze. That allows, you know, the manure a chance to work back into the soil. I saw a study not too long ago that actually looked at that and said that if it wasn't net carbon zero, you know, the regeneration of the soil, the amount of carbon put into the soil, balanced the amount of greenhouse gases that the cattle put in the air. If it wasn't net zero, that it was fairly close. So there's definitely very, very strong arguments for doing what Tony's talking about. And from what I've read, the management of your cattle like that can be done very economically as well. I mean, you have to have paddocks that are relatively small. You have to be able to herd the cattle from one paddock to the next paddock in a very economical way. But again, what I've seen says that that can be done if it's organized properly. Incidentally, at some point in this discussion, I'm going to have to ask Sheldon about his backdrop, because Sheldon's an artist. And is that one of your works, Sheldon? Because it's really a nice one, the skyscape that you've got behind you. And I have a sister in Saskatchewan who's a painter, and she loves skyscapes, probably for the same reason, because you're so much of your environment is sky. When you look out, the land is so flat that sky really does dominate. So it's a lovely backdrop you've got there.
Unfortunately, no, it's not my painting. Um, it's an inspiration to me, and I use it to
Mm.
use it as my backdrop so I can. I'm actually trying to recreate that same skyscape that you see behind me. But more importantly, back to regeneration. When we're regenerating, my grandfather, he brought up a very good question with me early on, about 10 years ago. He said, they're making snow. Um, they're making snow out of human waste.
What?
And
What?
yeah, yeah, they're making snow and for people to ski on, they're making fake snow.
Okay, where? I will.
This is right here. We have Flagstaff, Arizona,
Uh-huh.
and they're regenerating water. And this is water that is broken down. It's broken down chemically to where we're
Well, as I
regenerating.
understand it, you can clean water if you do it right by running it through, natural environment. I mean, over stones and various plants and things like that. Well, that's how water does get cleaned in nature. It
Yes,
rains or we make a mess and
purification.
then it gets cleaned up by just running along in the right kind of stream. But uh, and there are certain areas, I think maybe it's Singapore, did I read about that they are cleaning their drinking water by taking dirty, gray water and cleaning it by running it through a natural kind of, it looks natural, but it's really very well constructed. Does anybody know anything about that? I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about here.
Well, there are constructed wetlands that are designed to do the filtering process that you would normally get in nature. But I think that raises one of the questions is perhaps the animal we need to get rid of the most is human beings, because we have got way out
So
of
how do
balance
you
in
plan to
terms of,
get along? I
well,
thought you were a pacifist, man. Don't
well,
tell
I
me
am
that.
a pacifist. I'm not saying we knock everybody else off, but the issues of figuring out how to refigure how we have supportive communities and loving communities for our children that don't create the kind of pressure so that maybe we have 10 adults per child or something for a while, because we are so badly out of balance and the impact that we're having. But the other thing that I want to say is I think we have far too many wealthy people whose environmental footprint is so much larger than 90% of the rest of the planets. And so unless we're prepared to address those things, I don't think regenerative agriculture is going to solve the problem. I don't think anything, because we are consuming at such a rate so much greater than the normal planet that we live on can replenish itself. But we can each do our part, but we have to redress this huge imbalance so that people with the billionaires can make choices that will have far more ranging and deep impact and than a peasant like me, or a peasant who's much less rich than I am, because I'm a very rich peasant compared with most peasants. But the thing I would like to say about livestock is we have the expression, it's not the cow, it's the how. And certainly feedlot agriculture, confinement agriculture for pigs and chickens, and we see them continuing to proliferate around our area as well as larger and larger land. But it's how we're doing it. And the prairies in North America, the savannas in Africa, the steppes in Asia, those were all the interaction of livestock with the rest of the system. Well, not wild stock, wild animals, herding wild animals. But we can't just get binary in our thinking and say, well, vegetables or animals. We have to recognize it's a complex web of life that we're enmeshed in. And if we don't recognize how well it interconnects and how important those interconnections are, we're going to still make silly decisions. I think the whole idea of that raised protein, I'd like to see the energy balance on that in terms of the equipment required, the energy used to heat and warm the stuff, where are the nutrients coming? Because bacteria do not live on air and water. They live on air and some form of nutrients. So where is this all coming from? I mean, if we want to talk about water purification, shit in a composting toilet. Don't do it in a water-based toilet. And we've got one on our farm that serves one of our houses, and the other one goes into a septic tank that gets the solids get pumped out and spread on the land about every 3 years. But you know, we need a systems approach that sees how things are interconnected. But again, food is a critical input to human beings, and how we manage that. We have choices 3 times a day. For most of us who are lucky enough to eat 3 times a day, where's that food coming from? Is how it's raised helping solve problems, or is it got a whole lot of collateral
Okay,
damage being
I
done?
want to focus. I really think there are some contradictions here that we have to decide we want to do this or we want to do that, and why. Now, I watch a lot of videos on YouTube, and I'll tell you about 2 different kinds of videos that I've been seeing, which don't say the same kind of thing at all. I showed you one about rewilding. There are people who really say that we can get along fine with either plant-based protein or the production of these new things that it's called Solein. I think it's a kind of substance that I guess maybe looks like tofu or something, but it's not these vats that make meat, artificial meat. No, it's actually made, it's a different substance. At any rate, that's going to be coming along, and you can feed all the protein in the world from that kind of thing, or from seaweed, if you like seaweed. I got some, but I don't much like it. Anyway, that kind of argument, once we can feed the world and produce enough food, protein with non-meat, non-animal based stuff, then what we can do is allow for rewilding. We can let the grasses, the deep rooted grasses, grow on the prairies again, and restore the kind of environment that actually is better for climate. On the other hand, now that's one kind of future that's being put forward as something for us to think about. The opposite was one I think I saw last night, which was about the use of robots in farming. Now here you're an organic farmer. I think you want us to do very natural kinds of things. But this video was full of images of machines doing vast quantities of operations, of procedures, doing the whole farming. You don't have to have any people, and the machines they use don't look like old-fashioned tractors. They look like more like people, doing very complicated things with huge, you're right, it looked like monoculture to me. Now, is there a future for this kind of highly mechanized agriculture? It's way more mechanized. They showed things picking the fruit off trees, and they could be selective. They only pick off the ripe fruit. They don't get the bad fruit or the raw unripe fruit. So is there a future for that at all in your world, or not?
Well, I guess we'll have pie in the sky when we die. To me, it's a bit like hydrogen cars. We have all these fantastic. We think that I have an Amish community that settled in our area and grow up in our area in the last 50 years as we did. And here's a community that does hand labor and takes joy in the labor that they're doing and takes joy in the community. Wouldn't be for everybody. But what are we going to do with all the people that we displace from agriculture in the countries that haven't already industrialized, where people actually grow their own food until they're displaced off the land by some big investment company with robots? I don't see this as an attractive future. And again, I'd like to see the energy balance for creating that equipment. Our mentality in the European, North American approach is get rid of the people. Get rid of the people. Well, unless you shoot them, you've got a problem when you get rid of the people and knock them off the land. And where are the entry-level jobs for teenagers these days in North America? Don't pump gas anymore. We are just creating a situation that's a social disaster, that's an ecological catastrophe, and that I think is an economic obscenity in terms of the way the wealth gets concentrated. So I don't see it as having a happy future. I see it as the future that some people think we need to move to, but I don't think it's going to be a happy place. So on our farm, I try to encourage us to use a little garden cart to move things around rather than a four-wheeled mechanized thing. We have used horses as part of our workforce, so we do have a tractor. But I firmly believe
you're going to have to sell your products. And when a robot can make your stuff at a tiny fraction of the cost it takes you, because I did watch a different show. This guy Tony Seba is saying that robots are going to be taking over within the next 5 years, and they are, they look sort of like people. They're shaped like human bodies, and they can outdo us any day of the week by 10 20 times as good as we are at anything we want to do. So
they can manufacture cars we shouldn't be driving, and just keep this consumer thing moving along. Yeah, we're have you seen you might want to look at the movie The Matrix, Meta. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that one? It's where the machines displace us.
Alan and Sheldon offer their opinions.
Yeah. Let Alan. I would like to hear your views on this one, Alan.
You mean on the question of increasing mechanization on robots themselves? I've got, so I come from a family that homesteaded in Saskatchewan in 1906. So, my grandfather went out as a 17-year-old and had to turn sod on, 5 acres or something in the first year to gain it. Had to use oxen to break the soil because horses at the time couldn't put a plow through the prairie sod. So they're in the same farm that, they've been on now for, what are we looking at, 130 years, roughly, a little less than 120 years, same family still farming. The farm itself, I think, is growing from the original, whatever it would have been, quarter section to something like 1,200 or even maybe 2,000 acres. So they still consider themselves a small farm. They couldn't farm a farm that size without large equipment. And I think large equipment is probably appropriate in areas where you've got large flat fields because, that's the way the equipment was designed. So I don't have a problem with large equipment per se. There is always, Tony's comment about the energy required to make the equipment versus the energy required to do that same farming with a smaller scale. I suspect that's actually quite economical on that scale. In other farms where you've got much smaller areas, I think it would be different. So, I think
sure, go ahead.
There is no, one suit fits all. I think you have to look at the farm. You've got to look at the crops that are available. That can be farmed on that, and you've got to say what's the best way to do this. What's the best way to do this? Not just to earn money, but for the future. So I wouldn't want to make judgments. I'm not a farmer, as I said before. I've had a good sized garden, but it's only 40 feet by 40 feet. It's a lot less than an acre. When we first came here, I think we grew corn on a quarter acre, which we sold at the market and sold at the end of the lane. But that's as close as we come to farming, and that hardly counts as real farming. So I'm not an expert, but as I said, I think my bottom line is that you've got to look at the particular land, you've got to look at the crops that are available, and you have to say what makes the most sense ecologically and financially, because the farmers have to live in this land. I remember an uncle telling me, this is now probably 10 years back, that he was getting the same amount per bushel of wheat that he got 15 years ago. And in dollar terms, uninflated dollar terms. And the reason that they can do that and still survive on a farm is because of mechanization at that stage. as the price of carbon goes up and the expenses from carbon goes up and the problems with climate change increase over time, those things are going to have to be continuously reevaluated. And as I say, I'm not a farmer. I can't make those judgments. I think what we have to do is we've got to look at each situation individually and say what makes the most sense here for humanity, for the land, and for our nutrition.
Thank you. Okay, I want to ask Sheldon about the Navajo farmers, because you say that the people around there had a good crop this year, but I wonder how many of the people that you know, how much farming does go on around there, because you're on the edge of a desert, but apparently you're in a farming zone. Do you know a lot of Navajo farmers, and what are they doing? Are they changing with in either direction? Are they taking up this kind of regenerative farming that we have heard Tony describing, or are they looking to mechanize more, or are they trying to live by their traditional methods of farming? What are these people like? I've never met a Navajo artist until I met you. Now I can say I've never met a Navajo farmer.
Well, I come from a Navajo farming background.
Okay.
My great grandfather, which I was very fortunate to learn, and he had these traditional ideas about farming. And I grew up right at the base of a mountain, the Chuvska Mountain. And we're very fortunate enough to farm. And we had the water coming down, we had the snow, we have a spring that continues. And today there are not a lot of farmers. The land, the people, our people have, right in my community there in Lukachukai, they decided to go off the reservation because farming is not an idea of succession. And a lot of people have really been trained to go get an education. And that's where your survival is going to be. So there are very few farmers today.
So the farmers have tried to take up urban lifestyles and professions and that kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah, it's because of it's because of the fact that there's not a lot of, like Adam has said, they got to survive, and they can't survive farming and agriculture. It's it's a seasonal thing, and they don't make enough money
Yeah.
to live off the
I
land.
mean, I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just trying to find out what the trends are in the.
Yeah, that's the trend. So, I mean, I should have been a farmer, but I decided to go with the arts.
Well, good for you. I mean, that's beautiful. Variety is the spice of life. We've used up our time, friends.
There's one thing.
And we've wandered around, but I think we've covered some important questions. Is there anything anybody feels a burning need to say, that if you don't get a chance to say it, you'll feel thwarted for the rest of your life?
Yes,
Tony,
I do.
It might be you.
And that is that the only way we have our current industrialized agriculture is because of fossil fuels. It takes about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to put 1 calorie of food on your table. And that is totally unsustainable. It's what's allowed the mechanization. And the interesting thing is I've been involved in renewable energy stuff and farm stuff. And when you work at it, it takes about the same amount of energy from your crops to turn into biofuels to run the equipment that it would take to run those oxen or those horses or yourself. So the only reason we've been able to create this supposedly incredibly productive agriculture is by plundering the fossil fuel system and dumping it in. And now we know that maybe wasn't such a great idea in having a climate that will support agriculture and ongoing food production. So we are in a devilish, hellish mess in
Mhm.
terms of what we've gotten used to. So that I think is an important part when we say you have to have this equipment. We have structured an economy to burn fossil fuels, and we've done it all across every occupation, be it agriculture, whatever. And so you have to really step back far to think about, well, how can we do it differently? And that's where I think a lot of indigenous approaches to the land hold out a hope of something that worked in the past, but it's going to be really hard to get there with populations where they are and expectations where they are and infrastructure
All right,
where it is.
I'm going to try to pick up that theme and say, get hold of some indigenous farmers so they can elaborate on the kinds of vision that you have. Because I mean, I don't know anything about how they farm here in Ontario, and much less in Australia or some of these other places. So it's we have a new agenda, something else that we have to look into. And I've had this, I'm delighted that we had this conversation, and I hope somebody else finds it as interesting as I do. So be sure and share it with your friends, and and if you want to comment, go to our website, because there are places, comment columns, where you can discuss these things and add anything that you want to say or dispute something that somebody else has said. So thank you all. And I want to wish you all a happy day. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Right.
Good.
Nice to meet
Sheldon,
you.
pleasure to meet you. And
Hey,
Alan,
pleasure
we'll
to
see
meet
you.
you guys.